Dennis Porter.
Yo.
Presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. Did I get that right?
Ramaswamy.
Ramaswamy.
You got it, man.
Good to see you again.
It's been a minute. You got a haircut.
I did get a haircut. Yeah, I grew it long and then realized it was shit, so I cut it all off.
I can't say I hated that, but you look clean. You know, ready to run for president.
Ready? Yeah. Well, I can't do that sadly because I'm British.
Oh, that's you know. Once you're kind of old, ready to run for king.
You can't be king, can't be president, unless I marry into kingship.
Wait, why can't you be king?
I'd have to marry into it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long future ahead.
I'm a commoner. They don't want the peasants there with a crown.
Anyway, good to see you again.
Yeah, man, I've got to tell you something funny. So we last met in Nashville. When was it?
It was a little while ago, long before I was on this journey.
Yes, and do you know what happened? When you walked out of that room, Danny turned around to me and said, he's going to run for president.
You kidding me?
I swear to God.
I called it.
He called
You called it before I called it.
He did. He said,
I was a part of it. It was all part of a journey when I was just traveling this country with an open mind. I thought I was going to do it through business, actually, was the way I wanted to drive change. But you said that day?
I swear on my children's lives.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate that. I'll take that in a good way.
Yeah.
And, well, here we are.
Now, here we are. And now you're a presidential candidate. You're crushing. Let's
Thank
be
you.
fair.
We're just getting warmed up, I hope.
Why did you decide to do it?
You know, I've been thinking about different ways to drive change in this country. I was a CEO of a biotech company. I had to, make a decision, and it was not an easy decision. But in the aftermath of the George Floyd death and the BLM-related protests across America, where companies, I don't know if you remember this, but 3 years ago, it was a very suffocating environment where you had to bend the knee to one orthodoxy as a CEO. That was it. Every company was coming down on one side of this fraught social issue. And I refused to do it because A, it didn't match my personal convictions, and I did not want to be fake about what I said as a CEO. But B, I didn't think it was the job of a CEO to do it. And yet, that had adverse consequences for me as a CEO. And I worried that it would have adverse consequences for the business. And so I had to change, when multiple advisors to my company resigned and whatnot in the wake of what I view as not political statements, but just principled statements that we're staying out of this kind of thing and we're focusing on our mission. That wasn't good enough in that moment in corporate America. And so I stepped aside from my job as a biotech CEO so I could speak my mind freely. I thought maybe there was a path in politics to drive change, and there was a U.S. Senate race in Ohio, literally, that opened up weeks after, it was a coincidence, but weeks after I stepped down from my job as CEO. But one of the things I got to know was, how broken that legislative process is. So somebody gave me a good piece of advice. You might want to know what the job entails before you interview for the job, and that's what you do when you campaign. And the more I got to know about the legislative process of how the sausage making works, of the negotiations of an individual piece of legislation, which most people don't even read before they vote on, I actually decided that politics would not be the way that I would go, and ended up trying to drive change through the private sector. And we can talk a lot about that. I started a business called Strive to compete against BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. I wrote a series of books. I wrote 3 books in the last couple of years, 2 of them about different elements of the politicization of the market, one about the ESG movement in particular. And so I thought that was the way I was going to drive change. All that being said, I think that, as much as the swamp lives outside of government, the ultimate bureaucracy of all is the bureaucracy in the administrative state. And all roads kept leading back to that invisible fist of government, not the invisible hand of the market, but the invisible fist of government, particularly the administrative state, that lurked behind a lot of the cultural and economic challenges that I was taking on through the private sector. So, Purva and I had our second son last year. Purva had him. I did my part in trying to be helpful, but we brought our second son into the world. And we were at the end of last year, and we look ourselves in the mirror. We're putting in a lot of hard work in driving, whatever positive change we can in the short time we've been given on this earth. But we look ourselves in the mirror, I did certainly, and ask myself, how am I going to use my skill set to drive maximal change in this country? And I think all roads pointed to the root cause of that cancer. And unlike the U.S. Senate seat, which I, for a hot second, had considered a few years ago, before you and I met, and before I thought I'd hung the jersey on politics, That's driving change through a legislative process that itself is broken and is an illusion. Here, the ultimate bureaucracy that I think is sucking the lifeblood out of the American Republic and sucking our freedoms out along with it is actually in the purview of the US president to solve. And so it's not just running for president, it's something in hierarchy, that's the highest position, go for it. No, there's a unique problem that needs to be solved now. It's going to take somebody coming in from the outside with total disregard for the norms of Washington, D.C., likely somebody who's been an entrepreneur, who knows how to break glass, but also someone who knows and understands the Constitution. And I'm not saying this to boast, I'm saying this as a matter of self-reflection. Those two qualities don't really coincide. You could be a legal academic and have a deep understanding of the Constitution, but you're not going to have the qualities of an entrepreneur or a glass breaker. Or you might have, and this is one of the unique features that Donald Trump brought to the presidency, be an outsider, be a businessman. But those people tend not to have a first personal understanding of the Constitution. And so if I look myself in the mirror and ask myself, this country's afforded me an education, and my parents have given me an upbringing, and this country's allowed me to live the American dream, how do I use my unique set of attributes to have a maximal positive impact on reviving the soul of this country and the essence of who we are? Turned out, running for president was the way to do it. And so that's why I'm on this journey, and I think we're not going to stop until we're done and we succeed.
But there's waking up and saying, okay, I'm going to run for president. It's quite a bold move. There's doing it. But historically, the people who tend to win the presidency have either a deep history in politics, or their family has a deep history in politics, or Donald Trump had a high profile with his business and what he's done with his TV show. You didn't really have those, yet you still come in as this kind of curveball, and you're now, I'll put Donald Trump to one side at the moment because I don't know what he's doing, but it feels like you're the leading, most credible candidate.
I appreciate that, man.
And that's not me saying you're credible. It's from the opinions I've said to spoke to everybody else. I've spoken to a lot of people, and a lot of people have said to me, if it's not Trump, it's Vivek. And I've also heard people saying, people who would vote for Trump will now vote for Vivek. And I don't know how you've done it.
Well, I think it's through sharing my convictions. I mean, a lot of times, some of my views that I've shared are unorthodox, but they're my convictions. And I think that's my political strategy. Share your actual convictions. Don't try to tell people what they want to hear. There's an old saying from Thomas Sowell, actually. If you care about someone, you tell them the truth. If you care about yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. And so there are things I've said in this campaign that have challenged orthodoxies 360 degrees in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, amongst people who thought they were America First conservatives, but now actually this is what it really means to put America first. We have to rediscover what America is. And so in the short run, that has presented some challenges in this race. I think my, people who are my pollsters and otherwise could tell you, here are some things you could have said a little bit differently and you'd be ahead of where you are right now. They're probably in the short run right about that. But I think in the long run, people have a good sixth sense for somebody who's giving them their actual convictions. And I think that we live in a moment where the government's been lying to the people systematically for a long time, from the premise of the war in Iraq to the premise for the bailouts in 2008 to the Trump-Russia collusion hoax that never was, that I challenged that Republican moderator on the last debate about, to the Nashville Transgender Shooter Manifesto. We were in Nashville when we last spoke, to how many federal agents were in the field on January 6th, to how our money's being spent in Ukraine. I mean, the list just goes on, to the origin of COVID-19. And I think people are very hungry for somebody who is willing to at least share their actual convictions. And my end of that bargain, or the deal I'd like to make with the voters of this country, is I'll do that. And for your part, you don't have to agree with 100% of what I say to support me. I think you probably want to agree with most of what I say, but you don't have to agree with 100% of what I say to support me. You just have to know that I'm telling you what I believe 100% of the time. That means that as a relatively young person, at least in politics, I'm 38. I'm the youngest person ever to run in the Republican Party. That means occasionally, am I going to think something that's different than I did 10 years ago? Yeah, I did. Because I've evolved, because of my experiences, and I'm a human being. And if you're a human being and you're not responding to changes in the world and changes in your own experience, then you're probably, not fitted to be the kind of person who leads the country either. In politics, it doesn't reward, I think, human attributes very much in the short run. But I think in the medium to long run, and I hope that's measured in the time span of this race even, I think it's going to lead us to be successful. And, one way or another, I would rather speak the truth and be who I am at every step of the way than to win by playing some carefully crafted political snakes and ladders. And so far, that seems to be working.
And will Nikki Haley be your running mate?
No. No, she won't. I think, I think she's hopefully going to get her long-awaited seat on the board of Raytheon and then Lockheed, and maybe she'll be able to double up and do both at the same time. So I wish her well in that future career and wish her to make as many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars doing it that she, I'm sure, has long aspired to.
Well, listen, look, we are going to get into the Bitcoin stuff. I've got my friend Dennis Porter here who helped facilitate this, so thanks, Dennis, because that's an important part. You about to say something?
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because, clearly our country is in a place where it's extremely divided, and we have both sides lobbying sort of bombs at each other. Even myself, I'm center left. You'd probably consider yourself at least center right.
I don't even see the spec. I'll come to that in a second. I don't even. I think we got to break this. We got to break the axis,
please.
Actually, because center left, center right, far left, far right. That presumes that there's one axis and then there's two poles to the axis. I don't think that's what the political spectrum looks like today, actually. I mean, if you look at an issue that's particularly important to me right now, I think we're marching our way into World War III. I think it's deeply dangerous. The American people have not yet fully processed those risks. I think the funding of the war in Ukraine is a disaster. That's a bipartisan idea. Right? And so most of the most important themes that we need to address today are actually bipartisan in the stupidity of them. And I think that there are other opportunities for change that are nonpartisan of how we actually revive the country. I mean, this basic idea that I talked about at the blockchain conference, that the people we elect to run the government ought to at least be the ones who actually run the government. Maybe they're people who I didn't vote for, but at least let it be the people who we, the people, elected. These are not black ideas or white ideas or even red ideas or blue ideas. I think they're fundamentally American ideals. And I want to say something about the division point. I began this campaign believing that we are deeply divided as a country and I want to unite this country. Here's what I've found. The real dividing line in this country is certainly not between black and white, as the traditional media would have you believe. But it's not even between Democrat and Republican. I don't think so. I think it's between, and there's different ways you could cut this, the managerial class versus the everyday citizen. I think that's one important axis. You could cut it between those of us who believe in the founding ideals of the United States of America, unbridled meritocracy, the unbridled pursuit of excellence, absolute free speech, and I'm a free speech absolutist, that any opinion goes, no matter how heinous. The rule of law, self-governance, the idea that we, the people, self-govern in a constitutional republic where every citizen's voice and vote counts equally. Here's what I found. We're taught to believe that we're divided. I actually have now traveled a majority of states in this union. I can tell you with conviction, this is not an opinion, I think this is a fact. 80+% of Americans in this country agree on those rules of the road. Maybe they disagree on, the details, corporate tax rates being high or low, or abortion even, and I'm not dismissing the importance of questions like that. But on the basic principles and the rules of the road, 80+% of this country agrees on it. And half the 20% are people younger than us who never learned those ideals in the first place. And I think we can bring them along too. So this notion of national division at the level of people in the country, when you take TV screens and social media, et cetera, out of it, is actually, I now believe this with conviction, is actually a myth. We're sold to believe that we're actually divided when the basic rules of the road actually we're united on. And the individual policy disputes don't have to go to the level of deep division if it weren't for the projection of division that we're fed largely by the media and by modern offshoots of media. And so why do we fall for it? I think we fall for it because we happen to now live in a moment, it's not all just the advent of social media and everything else. Those are the vectors, but there's an underlying pre-existing condition where we find ourselves at a moment in our national history when faith, patriotism, hard work, family, the things that used to fill our sense of purpose and meaning, those have all disappeared right around the same time in American history. And there's deep-seated causes for that. I talk about this in one of my books. But when you have that vacuum of purpose, then you're vulnerable to almost fall for anything. And so I'm not sort of preaching that everybody has to be religious or this or that or the other thing, but like, here's a basic prescription: faith, family, patriotism, hard work. Try to pick two. You don't have to go all four. That's but two. Try to pick two. We can't be at zero, because if you're at zero, you're going to then bend the knee to something, and so you're going to be sold the myth of national division or the myth of climatism, which is different than any particular individual claim about climate change. It's a religion, or COVIDism, or wokeism, or transgenderism, or Zelenskyism, which has become a bit of a religion in the United States of America in both parties. These are symptoms of this deeper void of purpose. And so I think part of my task is I can't fill that full hole as the US president, but I can fill part of it with the vision of our national identity, of who we are as Americans. And that's a task I'm setting out to achieve. Now, it's a long and winding road to get there. I think that sounded optimistic. I'm not a Morning in America. I'm not an It's a Morning America person, right? It's not Morning in America right now, but it can be. And I think the choice that we make in the next few years, I think within the next decade or less, if we don't get this right in the next decade, I don't think we have a country left. I think it's the end of the United States as we know it. Maybe it'll exist as a geographic space, but that's also, to your question earlier, I mean, that's what drew me into this race with the sense of urgency.
Well, listen, look, I've been traveling here for 2 decades now.
Yeah.
Probably been here nearly 100 times. I've never been to any other country more. I love it over here. It's great. And what you see on the TV is very different from your experience when you're here, when you go out,
Yes,
you meet people.
yes.
It's great.
That's my point.
You don't see that. But I do believe that the media and whatever, the political class, the elites, whatever, have weaponized the 20% difference.
Totally. So you want to get deep of what's going on there?
Yeah.
Okay, because this is the stuff I don't do in campaign speeches.
It's all incentives, right?
Well, yes, it's incentives. But let me see if you mean that in the same way that I do. I do agree with that. But so to me, the story is clear, actually. What's happened is failed institutional elites, leaders of institutions that have failed to fulfill their purpose for existence, and used to get criticized from it, let's use political lingo here, by the left, have weaponized this new apologist brand of progressivism as a deflection tool to deflect accountability for their own failures. A lot of jargon there. Let me just use some specific examples. 2008, the financial crisis and the bailouts that followed. What happened? You had the old left that said, and by the way, I think there's a lot of validity to this claim. That's not capitalism. Using public taxpayer money to bail out a bunch of big banks that took risks when times were good, made boatloads of money doing it, and then now are pinning it to the public to bail them out when times go bad. That's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. So you know what? We'll occupy Wall Street, and we'll demand that you redistribute all that money from those wealthy corporate fat cats to poor people to help poor people. That's what the old left had to say. But right around that time, there was this new strand of the left that said, well, it's not quite economic injustice we're after. It's racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry and climate change. Now, if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street is a pretty tough pill to swallow. But this new, let's call it the woke stuff, is pretty easy, actually. Applaud diversity and inclusion. Put some token minorities on your boards. Talk about systemic racism. Muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in that private jet to Davos. We can do that. That we can handle. And so you have this sort of arranged marriage. And I just happen to, I bring this one up first because it's the one I happened to see first. I got my first job in the fall of 2007, right on the eve, in New York City, in a finance firm, right on the eve of the '08 crisis. So interesting time to get a first job. That's where you see that arranged marriage, where you have one institutional class of unlikely bedfellows, right? The folks on Wall Street somehow embracing this new woke orthodoxy. Interesting how that arranged marriage took place. But then you open your eyes and you see it everywhere, right? The old breakup big tech around that time used to come from the left. Silicon Valley says, all right, well, take it easy over there. We'll use our monopoly power to censor hate speech or misinformation as you guys vaguely over there define it, but leave us alone and leave our monopoly power intact. It worked. Oh, Coca-Cola says, okay, we used to get criticized from the left for spreading diabetes and obesity in the black community. Hold the phone. We'll talk about teaching our employees how to be less white. Call voter ID laws in Georgia racist, even though we're a beverage company and we don't have anything to do with voting laws in Georgia. But that's okay. We'll interject ourselves. Great. Defang the left. Now, it's not just in the corporate sphere. You go to the military. 25 years of pointless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. $7 trillion added to our national debt. People my age sent to go die fighting somebody else's war by the thousands, innocent Americans. And to what end? The Taliban's in charge 20 years later. Iraq is still a broken country. Totally failed. The left used to be the ones criticizing the Iraq war and those Middle Eastern wars. Remember that. This was a Republican creature. Remember, the bailouts were also under a Republican administration, which goes back to the fact that it's not about Republicans and Democrats. It's far deeper. Well, what does General Mark Milley then say? Does he want accountability for admitting that the Iraq war and the Afghanistan occupation thereafter was a failure? No. So he says, we'll muse about white rage and systemic racism. It's woke smoke to deflect accountability for their own failure. Look at the schools. We'll shut down public schools for 2 years in the name of COVID-19. Well, it's interesting how COVID only affects teachers in public schools, but not private ones. Funny how that works. Private schools managed to remain open. Shut down the public schools in inner cities for nearly 2 years. Take my hometown of Cincinnati, shut down for an entire year. I went to public schools through 8th grade. I went to a private high school for high school. My alma mater for high school was St. Xavier High School. They closed for 4 days at all during the entire pandemic. That was it. So interesting how it only affects the teachers in public schools. Well, now what do they say? 2 years later, black kids in the inner city aren't testing as well as white or Asian kids in the suburbs. So what do they start saying? Math is racist. I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. This came out, from teachers unions otherwise last year. Math is racist. Now, 2 + 2 = 4. Math is not racist. But what might be inequitable is the failure to teach those kids in the inner city how to do math because teachers unions got a perk of getting 2 years off while collecting full pay. It is woke smoke to deflect accountability for their own failure. So are we really divided that half the country believes that math is racist, that the United States was born in 1619 as some racist project designed to oppress the oppressed, and that's what this nation was founded on? Of course not. Do we have to somehow stop burning carbon, and even if we shift that to places like China, that it's racist and xenophobic to have a border that we actually respect or whatever? No, most people don't believe this. It's not even close. It's not 50-50. So it's this fringe minority, the other side of this war, I guess you could call it. But it's 10-20% of this country, but they've been weaponized because of incentives. Whose incentives? It's the failure of the leaders from the military to our public schools to K-12 education to college education to Wall Street to Silicon Valley to corporate America that use this to defang criticism that used to come from the left, but they've weaponized this new strand of the left to deflect accountability. So that's a long story, I know, but that's, I think, why this fringe minority is still winning the war for the soul of this country. And I think it takes a commander-in-chief who, first of all, understands this. Right? I think you can't win this war if you don't know that you're in one or what the terms of it really are. And that's part of, again, what called me into this. You see a bunch of Republican politicians that will, read with varying gradations of outrage what's served up to them on their teleprompter. I think you probably need somebody who understands the why more than just the what that they're reading back to people. It goes back to if you care about someone, you tell them the truth, or at least tell them what you believe. If you care about yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. Politicians in both parties, that's what they're acclimated to doing. And so, yeah, I think it's not 1980 anymore. The threats to liberty are complex. They present themselves in new ways. Government using backdoor channels of private companies or private actors in the space that you all are in the realm of currency, in the realm of capital. That's what's happening in the country. But I think it takes somebody who sees that with a level of clarity in order to be able to actually have a shot at forever fixing it.
And I think there will be a lot of Republican voters who will love what you're saying here.
Oh, yeah.
But if you want to unite the country, how do you express this criticism of the left whilst also bringing them back on side?
Well, I think actually if you listen carefully to what I just said, It's not really a criticism even of the left. It's a criticism of an arranged marriage between institutional elites who aren't at all of the left, but who have entered this arranged marriage that's not really a marriage of love, but more like a mutual prostitution with a certain strand of the left. They're two strange bedfellows that together get in bed and they create this new bastard child, this woke industrial complex that's far more powerful than state power or corporate power alone, because it's a hybrid of the two that together can do what neither can on its own. That's really what I'm criticizing. My first book was Woke Inc. People remember the book as Woke. No. The title of the book was Woke Inc. And I used this was before that word became popular in American parlance. The ink is where the emphasis is, actually. It's the cynical exploitation of, there are certain people, some person dyes their hair pink, has a nose ring and thinks they're a gender different than their biological sex. It's a free country. You're allowed to do that. I personally think many of those people are lost and maybe hungry for purpose that others in positions of leadership have failed to serve them. And that's okay. That's part of a free country as long as we don't have the cynical intervention of entrenched elite institutional failed leaders that are using that for their own cynical ends. And I think that's actually that's not a criticism of the left or the right. It's a deep understanding of how a fringe worldview, an anti-American worldview that was about challenging the system. And I'm a guy who, agree or not with what you say, if somebody's really going to be a challenge to the system, I'm always going to give you some credit for that, right? That takes guts. But what began as a challenge to the system became the system. And I think that's not a critique of one end of a political spectrum. It's a critique of a merger of state, corporate, and institutional power that I think poses some real danger to the future of this republic.
I think my question's still valid, though, in that...
How do you unite the country?
Well, how do you unite the country? Because even if it is a fringe part, even if it is a fringe group, it is still some of these ideas, some of this maybe perhaps ideology, is still attributed to the left. It is still defended by the left.
The ideology certainly is. And so I think there's many versions of the left. That's one thing I would say.
And sure, many versions of the right. But what I'm saying is that the country is divided on politics. It might not be divided in the street, in the cafes, in the bar. But when it comes down to an election, it will be divided because some people will want a Republican and some people will want a Democrat. And if you are going to unite the country, I still don't know how you're going to do that.
Well, my aspiration is actually to win this in a Reagan-style landslide, as Reagan did in 1980. And that sounds about as ridiculous for me to say today as it would have for Reagan to say in 1979, around the same time. I think that I rarely talk in terms of Republicans and Democrats in the campaign trail. Mm-hmm. I'm equally critical of the Republican Party as I am of the Democratic Party, but in different ways. I don't sit here bashing Biden, not because there isn't a lot to bash or criticize, and I do criticize him where it's due, but because I don't even think he's really the person running the country. I think he's a puppet of the managerial class in the administrative state. And I think that's something that Democrats and Republicans alike can agree is not the country we want to live in. I mean, agree or not with Donald Trump, you're free to vote for him or not. In the last couple of elections, we don't want to become a country where the party in power uses police force to eliminate its political opponents from running. We don't want to become a country. I think most people in this country do not want to be a nation where the elected representatives who are designed to make the laws are not the ones actually making the laws, that it's a bureaucrat who got their position because of civil service protections and can't be fired. I think that it takes a president who understands that they can be fired to be able to do it. So am I going to unite 100% of the country with that? No, I don't think so. But I think I can probably unite about 80% of this country. And with a little bit of work and showing up and being willing to engage with the next generation, maybe 90% of this country. I think half the battle is showing up. I mean, I've gone to probably more college campuses than any Republican presidential candidate has in modern history. I'm on TikTok. I was persuaded to do it.
Were you dancing?
You want to reach the next generation. What's that?
Were you dancing?
I've not done my best dances on TikTok.
I know you can rap.
Yeah, I think I had one where I was kind of jamming a little bit.
There's a TikTok dance.
I think I did some surfing on TikTok most recently. But my point is, even look at the places we go. South side of Chicago, not a place where Republican presidential candidates go. I've spoken to a room bigger than this one with about 100 people in it, 95%. 150% supposedly presumed to be Democrat, 95% black audience who you'd presume disagree with much of what I have to say. That's a room where I've never been in a room where people agreed with me more on the importance of ending the war in Ukraine, stopping spending our taxpayer money over there, building our own southern border defenses, including militarizing our southern border because they're turning South Shore High School in the inner city of Chicago into an encampment for migrants where they're paying $7,000 per migrant per month, where people in that community are rightly asking, what about me? I've been to the inner city of Philadelphia. I've been to Kensington. I don't know if those people are Democrats or Republicans, but it's literally like a scene out of hell that you see people walking around where I took videos there, posted them online. The number one response I got is he staged it. Because it looks like there were actors from some sort of ghoulish movie is what people literally on the internet thought that there's some hired actors that are walking around in this park. We're walking around people who are that lost from drugs. Their arms and feet are decaying from shooting themselves up from different kinds of drugs. No, those weren't paid actors. And it's sad that that's the country. You don't have to go to a third world country to see that. You could go to a third world country. It's called Regions of the United States of America. I've gone to Flint, Michigan, one of the forgotten cities, right? I mean, that happened, okay, relegated to the past. Well, Michael Moore's done that. I don't agree with Michael Moore on a lot of things, but at least he paid attention to Flint, Michigan. And so I think we can do this in a way that it's not going to unite 100% of the country, but it can unite 80% and 90% of this country. Showing up is half the battle. And here's my pledge as the next president. You will not agree with me on 100% of what I say. You won't. Now let's take a step back and say, it'd be kind of weird if you did, right? I mean, we're a country founded on the belief that you get to speak your mind and you do too, as long as I get to in return. That's the beauty of the United States of America. And that itself is a substantive value that we can unite around, actually. And I think that that's something we've long forgotten. And so I do believe people are hungry for that. Maybe I'm wrong, in which case I won't be the president, in which case I won't have the opportunity to unite. But if I'm the president, if I'm elected, it's on this message, right? So if on this message, the people of this country put me in that office, by definition, that's our path to national unity, because this is a message that says we can be united around shared national values even if we disagree on individual policies.
Can I selfishly ask you, if you become president, can I come and interview you again in the Oval Office?
Yes.
That would be...
I've actually made a decision. We're going to do I'm doing a weekly podcast as part of this campaign. We're going to continue that through my 8 years in the White House.
I want to come in the Oval Office. Come and see you. Okay. All right. We should get into the topics that people listen to this care about, which is money.
Yes.
Bitcoin. And all the sub-subjects of that, of getting away from a surveillance state, CBDCs. But the thing that really gets me is we've been making the show for a long time. And whilst it's a Bitcoin show, it's also really a macroeconomic show. And in 2008, in the financial crisis, I think it was 900 million was printed. And this year alone, I think it's 4 trillion has been printed. Mm-hmm. The dollar system is essentially a Ponzi now for the government. We're in a situation whereby they've had to raise interest rates to reduce inflation, but that brings in recessionary pressures. So they're going to have to reduce interest rates to stimulate the economy, certainly going into an election. But in doing so, they're going to have to print more money, which will drive inflation again. This is potential yo-yo Weimar Republic stuff coming to the United States. And if it comes to the United States, it comes to the rest of the world. Nobody's talking about cuts apart from maybe you.
Deep cuts.
But no one's talking about austerity. No one's talking about the government running a budget, running a fiscal surplus. So I want to know exactly the things that you want to do to fix it.
Yeah. So there's a lot.
Yeah.
I believe that the only answer, not just for fiscal reasons, but even for constitutional integrity reasons, 75% reduction in the size of the federal government. And that includes federal employees. I think the U.S. president has the power to do that on day one. And this made a lot of people when I said it, but they can't even get started on the first wave of it. Just as a thought experiment. I'm not saying this is exactly how we're going to do it, but as a thought experiment.
By the way, that's a lot of voters as well.
Well, some of them, if they're honest with themselves, may want actual better work in the private sector, and they can get it. And either way, the job of the government's not to provide employment opportunity. I don't believe that's the job of the U.S. government. So say what you will. Maybe we disagree on that one. Then if you're on the other side of me.
Oh no, I don't disagree.
No, not you. I'm saying whoever's on the other side of this can disagree with me, and they're entitled to their opinion. I would say on day one, even if you imagined, how do you wrap your arms around this? If your social security number ends in an even number, you stay. If it ends in an odd number, you go. Boom, 50% reduction on day one. Now, there's a beauty to that. People said that's glib. The reason US presidents haven't done it is that there are these so-called civil service protections that stop a president from firing somebody. You could be mired in court for years saying that, well, I was fired for political retribution, or it's a civil rights law violation, or whatever. Those civil service protections do not apply to mass layoffs. So you've completely shielded yourself from that criticism if the first wave of cuts is done with a chainsaw, not a chisel. I think that's what's going to be required. Is it going to be perfect? No, it's not. But there's no such, when the status quo is what it is, anyone who's proposing incremental reform is lying, or lying to themselves even. They may think they're telling the truth, but it's not going to happen, and it hasn't happened for every bit of that reason. It's like a multi-headed monster where you cut off one head, something else is going to grow back unless you actually go to the root cause and gut the thing at its very core. I believe in zero-based budgeting. I've been a CEO. I've built successful businesses, multiple multi-billion-dollar businesses. Well, part of what that means is that you don't just start with last year's budget as your baseline and then roll that over. You ask what's actually necessary from the ground up. That's never happened in our nation's history. Part of this, let's also do the math on the $33 trillion of national debt. $7 trillion of that was attributable to two foreign wars that literally could not have happened. Like, if you just pretend they didn't happen, not a thing would be different today. You could have had a limited targeted operation to take out the Taliban in Afghanistan, but that's like a tiny fraction of the cost of the occupation that came after, and the Iraq war thereafter that. $7 trillion of our national debt would be gone if it weren't for that. Now we're about to repeat the same mistake in places like Ukraine. My view is not a dime of foreign aid is going to be ever sent to a country whose national debt per capita is less than ours. And that's almost every country we give foreign aid to today. So I think that there are some reasonable practical steps we can take. And I think this is our last window to be able to do it before interest payments become the largest line item on the federal budget, which in turn has to, in the meantime, it's like showering cocaine on a drug addict. It's what the Federal Reserve has been doing to the American people, and politicians with 4-year election cycles or 2-year election cycles who have an incentive to see that through. And, I think that we're at the tipping point where if we continue with this much longer, we're not going to have a country left. It's like ancient Rome. They devalued the denarius. The amount of silver in the denarius went down to almost nothing. Back in their era, the way they used to fix it is go to Northern Africa or whatever and plunder and then bring some back. Well, there's a philosophical debate about whether that game can be played all over again, but that's not the way this game can play out this time around. And so this spells the end of an empire, the end of a nation, a once great nation, unless we get that back on track and right. So 75% reduction out of the gate, zero-based budgeting as the new norm in Washington, D.C., start with zero as the baseline, end any foreign war that doesn't advance U.S. interests, end foreign aid to any country that has a national debt problem that's smaller than ours, which is almost every other country that we give foreign aid to. And yes, that's the beginnings of a very pragmatic plan of how we lead our nation forward. Put the Federal Reserve back in its place, tie the Fed's hands. That's one of the fact that backstop exists is actually what allows a lot of these behaviors to continue. Right? People forget it's not just that they're doing it in response. The behaviors wouldn't have existed if the hands had been tied in the first place. How would I do that? Peg the dollar to a basket of commodities, period. With real value and fixed supply, period. That's it. It turns out when the dollar was pegged to the gold standard, we had our highest economic growth that we've had in our national history. It was averaging about 4% plus per year for most of our national history. Go off the gold standard, what do you know? The dollar becomes volatile. It's no longer stable. Pricing mechanisms are much more difficult, become less efficient in a marketplace. Economic growth is impeded on. Then you just have the growth in the mandate of the Federal Reserve, which becomes hostile to wage growth in this country. Every time wages grow up, they claim it's a leading indicator of inflation, try to tighten monetary policy into what's actually just a downturn of the business cycle because wages are the last thing to go up. Well, if wages are the last thing to go up in a business cycle and you claim it's a leading indicator of inflation and you tighten monetary policy into that, you give yourself the crises that you have. That was the source of the 2008 crisis, among other reasons. Then you have a boom, bust, and then what comes after the bust? Bailout. So the boom, bust, bailout cycle. That's how you get what happened after the tech crash, what happened after the 2008 financial crisis, in some limited measure, what's happened even over the course of the last year. And so that ends on my watch. Tie the hands of the Fed, but tie the hands against the backdrop where the government actually has to fiscally get its act together with true zero-based budgeting, deep cuts of the kind that I'm talking about. And one of those indulgences would be stopping fighting foreign wars that don't advance the American interest, which is a third of our national debt today.
Real
So I know
quick,
that was a lot
No,
there.
really
No.
quickly. I think you're touching on something really important that a lot of Bitcoiners would certainly agree with, and that is that the unlimited money printer in Washington D.C. is really what corrupts the incentives of the elected, whether
Yeah.
they be a politician or not, and it's sort of not really even the politician's fault. I mean, look at just as an
No, they're just
example.
pawns. You kidding me? These people aren't agents. They're vectors. They're
Yeah, but real quick, but just as an
vessels.
example, like at Satoshi Action, we do a lot of state work. So there's no money printer at the state level, right? They don't have this Federal Reserve that can just throw money at a problem every time they have an issue. And so the incentives are very different. We find actually very commonly that folks at the state level are really emboldened to create jobs, economic opportunity, things that we all agree we need and we have to have in order to grow as a country. But that's sort of different in DC because they have access to that printer. And so there's less of a need
it's
to
a backstop against which it changes. It's a moral hazard, actually, is what it is.
Yeah.
It's a moral hazard.
Same with raising taxes, right? Like they don't need to raise taxes. They can just print more money. And so they can sort of keep playing this game over and over and over again. So, but you're touching on something really important here, which is that, you're going to try to get rid of that. You're going to try to limit that. The ability for them to come in and use that money printer, which corrupts incentives and forces them to be us all to sort of like have to play in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only thing, and I think we're on the same page. I don't pin it all on that, but that's a very important factor. And so I think that there's always a trap to fall into to think that there's one silver bullet. I think there's no silver bullet. I think that there is a plethora of partial solutions. And this is definitely high on my list of those partial solutions, but absolutely correct. And I think if we tie the hands of, if we I'm seeing something plugged in there into the wall. If we pull that out of the wall, if we unplug the money printer, that actually ties our hands in a lot of ways that are good.
I'd keep it going for a few hours after you get elected.
Yeah.
I would print $1 trillion, buy Bitcoin, sit
you
on
go.
your hand for 10 years, and you'll be able to probably get rid of the national debt.
Leave it on for a little longer, the money printer.
just
a
put
few
some
microseconds.
Just put some Bitcoin in Fort Knox.
just actually when you get in office is to tell them not to sell the Bitcoin that they've already confiscated. I mean, there's a whole bunch of Bitcoin that the U.S.
Oh,
government
it's interesting.
holds,
And what's the magnitude of that right now?
They keep auctioning it off. I mean, they're one of the largest holders of Bitcoin in the entire world.
I mean,
They
the
keep
government
auctioning,
is?
but they keep auctioning it off.
Yeah.
So we consider it to be a strategic reserve, in fact. And so
It's actually very
we
interesting.
say
So
to
they already
them,
have their Fort Knox.
yeah, we should tell them to keep it.
Yeah.
I mean, just keep the.
The Bitcoin subject's important. Like, I believe in a fixed limit
Yes.
currency. I believe in censorship resistance. I like
That was the whole premise of the gold backing of the dollar.
But I'm a bit younger, and I prefer my gold on my phone or on my hardware wallet. But Bitcoin has defended my. Look, I work hard. I work really hard. I travel around the world. I do this podcast. I got a couple of businesses, but I work hard. I've been hit with inflation in the UK, quite heavy inflation. Bitcoin has protected me, and Bitcoin is something I want to hold. Now, if I was an American citizen, I would feel like, as a hardworking American citizen, why is Elizabeth Warren trying to attack my work and my defense of my wealth? What would you do?
Because
particularly
she has a fundamentally different worldview, right? Those of us who are having this conversation believe that we as individuals create a government that's accountable to us. The alternative worldview, you have to understand it, is that the state predates the individual, right? Your rights come from the government. They're not independent of that. And so if this proposes a threat to the existence of that state, then it's perfectly within the rights of the state to come after and prevent that from existing. And so I think there's a mistake that people in the, I would say in the lobbying community for Bitcoin or otherwise in Washington, D.C. make is, we just have to educate them. And once we educate them, then they'll understand. These people don't understand. No. You got it backwards. If only that were the problem. The problem isn't that they don't know what Bitcoin represents. It's that they do. And that's actually what creates the anaphylactic response.
So what's the answer? I'm conscious we got a 5-minute warning.
I'm having too much fun, guys.
Well, look,
Okay.
you can stay. You
We
can
gotta do this
didn't even
more.
get to
I'm
the
being
three
dragged
pillars.
out of here.
We didn't even get to the 3 pillars of your new.
Well, let's get to it.
Well,
Yeah.
but just what should they do then?
So here's I laid a comprehensive crypto policy. People should go to my website, vivek2024.com, check it out. We get the details. I gave a detailed speech about it earlier today too. But I think that we have to restore the constitutional principles on which this country was founded. There's 3 core pillars to my policy. One is the freedom to code. On that list is that code is speech. You can't go after
Tornado Cash.
If you want to go after Tornado Cash, go after somebody for stealing something that belonged to somebody else or for fraud, but you can't go after somebody on the premise of the code that they developed. The code of speech is the First Amendment violation. Financial self-reliance. That's what Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson would have stood for. Well, all of these AML laws and the know your customer laws. That's an infringement on your financial self-reliance. Get to the punchline on this one. Any self-hosted wallets or any regulations that impede the right to have self-hosted wallets rescinded. They're wrong. They're unconstitutional. And a lot of this dates back to the, third-party doctrine, which is something that I think the folks in the crypto space would do well to understand. It was infringement on our freedoms that began in the aftermath of 9/11 with the Patriot Act and otherwise. What did they basically say? They said that if you and I are having a conversation, we give up our right to privacy to a third party, namely the phone provider that's providing the phone that we're actually talking to each other through. That's a perversion of what the Constitution says or the law says. The current Supreme Court has begun to roll that back. Well, if you believe that, that means most of these know your customer laws and anti-money laundering laws that are being used to impede the anonymity of financial transactions, self-hosted wallets and otherwise, are also unconstitutional. So that's an opportunity. Then again, it takes a president who understands that to see that through. So that's the second pillar. First is freedom of code. Second is freedom for financial self-reliance. Punchline that applies to things like self-hosted wallets, not being impeded upon by unconstitutional regulations. Speaking of which, the third point then is the freedom to innovate without regulatory overreach. There's a Supreme Court case that came out last year, West Virginia versus EPA, that said several of those regulations coming out from the EPA are unconstitutional because Congress never gave them the authority to pass it. Well, that applies to basically every regulation the SEC is misusing to put a chokehold on not just Bitcoin, but cryptocurrencies more broadly. And any other regulations like the Biden administration is proposing to say that there should be a special excise tax on those who use electricity to mine for Bitcoin. I'm sorry, Congress never authorized that, so the regulatory state doesn't get to do that. And by the way, think about the surveillance state they would require to know how your energy was being used in your home. That's Patriot Act 2.0. It's Dick Cheney 2.0 pervading both Republican parties. We launched a movement in our own campaign, no-to-neocons.com. You could check out what that entails. That's about keeping us out of foreign wars. But it relates to what we're talking about here, because the surveillance state here at home is part of what quashes dissent to the foreign wars that we fight. Anyway, that's part of what the assault on Bitcoin is a symptom of as well. So I'm dead set against any of those regulatory overreaches as well. Freedom to code, freedom for financial self-reliance, and most importantly, freedom to innovate free from regulatory overreach. And so, yes, I think I am the most pro-Bitcoin and pro-crypto candidate who's existed in American history, and I say that with a sense of pride. I'm told that I was the first Republican. They have these financial disclosures you put up if you're a presidential candidate that are required. Apparently, among the financial disclosures, I think I'm the first presidential candidate ever to own Bitcoin or crypto. So I think that's...
Well, I hope you don't own any crypto. You haven't got any shitcoins, have you?
I owned Bitcoin and Ethereum as of the time of the...
Vivek, you're a shitcoiner. Come on, man.
Okay, you guys are purists.
Right, listen, you got to take that Ethereum, trade it for Bitcoin.
Well, I don't trade my account anymore because I'm running for president. It's independently managed. But,
also, first Republican presidential candidate to accept Lightning donations.
Yes, we do.
Via Bitcoin, the layer 2. So that was a big move as well.
Yeah, you got to skate to where the puck is hopefully going for our country, but it's not going to go there automatically. And yeah, I just want to say this is sometimes in our community here, whatever, we fall in the trap of throwing up our hands and say, how can it be this way? And maybe have some fringe candidate running, outside the political party system and say, we're going to move the terms of the conversation. And that's important. I'm not taking away from that. But I'm in this to drive this actual change. We have a clear path to me serving as the next president of the United States and actually translating into action the things I've talked about in that conference, in this conversation today and otherwise. This is about action. And so at the start of this campaign, I was somewhat shy about asking about it. Our family has invested immense amounts of our wealth into this campaign, and we will stop at nothing. That's the inheritance we want to give our kids as a country, greater than the one we grew up in. But now I need the help of this community, because the establishment, RNC, the Republican National Committee, just last week, it's a corrupt institution, but the chairwoman said, I would not get another cent of funding from the RNC. Why? Because I've criticized them for their corruption publicly. Not making it up. But if you watch that third debate, that was why she said it. Okay, fine. But we're going to need to be lifted up by the people who are aligned with my views. And if that doesn't come from the traditional RNC or the traditional party system, then yes, I'm going to need people here. You can donate Bitcoin. You can donate in dollars. If you want to hold on to your Bitcoin and donate your dollars instead, either way, I'm going to ask people to do the maximum of what they're able. If you do your part, I have a clear path to beating expectations in Iowa and New Hampshire. I think that's almost set to happen will shatter the expectations, which gives me the momentum to then become the next president. And I think that will. I think we have. I wasn't going to ask people to do it before I knew that we had a path. We put up tens of millions of our own money to do it first. But now we have a clear path, and I need you all to lift me up. And so if people do their part, Vivek2024.com, donate in whatever format you want, we will do our part. And I think that this is not theoretical.
Right.
This is about action.
Last very quick question, so I know you got to go. And it's something that might even help you with your last point. Are you going to bring up Bitcoin in the debates?
If they don't bring it up, I will. Absolutely.
I'll hold you to that.
I've already told the moderators in the Republican Party, this should be a topic we need to be talking about. If they don't do it, I will.
All right, I'm holding you to that and a trip to the Oval Office.
Absolutely. We'll continue our podcast. We'll do a podcast episode from there.
Love it. Look, Vivek, thanks for your time. I know you're busy. Good luck with this, and we'll keep watching.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.